Good morning, everyone. Rydell Harrison joined the Partners for Educational Leadership in 2021. Prior to working with the Partners for EL, Dr. Harrison served as the superintendent of schools in Easton Reading Region 9 in Watertown. Before moving to Connecticut, he was the assistant superintendent of instructional services for Chapel Hill Carlboro City Schools CHCCS. Rydell began his career as a music teacher in New Jersey and has 22 years in education, working across all three levels. In CHCCS, Dr. Harrison also served as executive director of professional development. In 2016, Rydell received the award for excellence in Chapel Hill Carlboro City Schools District Administration. Prior to working in the district office, Rydell served as an elementary and middle school principal and assistant principal in Guilford County Schools, and was the principal at Phillips Middle School in CHCCS. Throughout his career, Dr. Harrison has worked to develop equity-focused initiatives designed to personalize learning, build teacher capacity, and eliminate racial disparities in student outcomes. He holds a Bachelor of Music Education from Rutgers University and a Master of Divinity from Duke University. He also holds a Master of School Administration, Specialist in Education, and Doctor of Education in School Leadership from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. After Mr. Rydell Harrison speaks, there's going to be a Q&A in the faculty room, so any of you who want to go speak to him for extra can go there as well. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Rydell Harrison to Taft.
Good morning. Yeah, good morning. So it's been a while since I've been in front of a group of students that look as fantastic as you guys. And so even though I can't see your smiles, I'm looking at your faces to kind of get that glimmer. It is something that I've been really excited about since I got the invitation to come and be with you all today. Excited to just share some information and really get to know you. And so I hope that you will, if you can, I hope that you will join me for the Q&A after, just to kind of chat and talk a little bit more about sort of what my experiences have been, or questions that you might have, or kind of what your plans are with some of the topics that we'll be thinking about and talking about today. Each February, we take a moment to acknowledge the historical achievements of Black Americans. Often these celebrations of Black excellence zoom in on the pioneers who hold the title of being the first in their field, the inventors whose creations have positively impacted our world, or the heroes who displayed courage in the face of extreme opposition. Carter G. Woodson, who organized the first Negro History Week in 1926, said this: "If race has no history, it has no worthwhile tradition. It becomes negligible. It becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands the danger of being exterminated." While the recognition of pioneers, inventors, and heroes during Black History Month is informative, it often lacks a true call to action that I think is needed to motivate young people just like yourselves. While the recognition is so important, I also want us to think about, how do we move past just recognizing people? I want to spend some time this morning thinking about some of the unfinished work rather than thinking about the accomplished work of some of these folks that you might see on screen. This is work that's in need of new pioneers, of new inventors, of new heroes. I want us to talk about belonging. To be seen, to be heard, to use my voice to make a change in the world, to live life with no apology. Brighton Farms, you have called me to be free. You guys are really kind. So these words are lyrics in a song that's sung by a girl named Violet, who's the lead character in the show The Girl from Ipanema, which is a new musical. Now, if you're a theater geek like me, right, where you know all the latest shows, you might be thinking, well, I've never heard of The Girl from Ipanema, a new musical. Well, that's because I'm writing it, and I'm only halfway done. And so stay tuned. It should be really good. In the show, this girl, Violet, who sings this song, is a Black trans woman. And she's working to find her home on the campus of Brighton Farms University. Although she's not the only character in the show to struggle with and to work on finding their voice, Violet understands that her marginalized identities as being Black and queer complicate the process of belonging. And based on her past experience, Violet knows that her ability to live her life without apologies and the freedom she longs for is actually typically regulated by those who possess power, those who possess privilege and cultural capital. Despite being in a new place surrounded by new people, Violet expects that the unwritten rules about which stories and which experiences and which identities are centered as part of the dominant narrative of our culture and climate, she's expecting that that will be the same at this new college as it has been in her K-12 experiences. And while Violet is a fictional character, her struggle to belong is real. One of the reasons the fictional campus of Brighton Farms University was chosen by Violet and her mother is because of their ranking as one of the safest universities in the country. But despite their safety status and its desire to become and create a welcoming environment for all students, regardless of their social identities, Violet actually does not expect to experience a genuine sense of belonging. Belonging is like food. We all know that it's important, but you don't recognize how important it is until you don't have it. Like Violet from the musical, I have also experienced the pain of not being seen or heard. In the show, Violet says that she chose her name because it represented the red anger of being ridiculed because of her identity and the blue sadness of being othered and alienated. For me, my grayness has been the barrier to belonging. In reflecting on who I am, I recognize that I don't fit the Black or white binaries of identity. And although I am many persons, I have not been able to name one identity that feels most comfortable. I'm Black, but not always in the traditional sense of what that means to other people. In my speech, I was told that I talked white. That was when I was a kid. And then when I became an adult, it changed to, well, you sound really articulate. I'm a male, but not always in the traditional sense of what that means to others. Because I was a single parent for a number of years, I found that it was important for me to be both mother and father to my children, nurturer and disciplinarian, and I don't subscribe to traditional gender roles. I'm middle class now, and I grew up middle class, but I have experienced what it feels like to live from paycheck to paycheck. And I know what it's like to not feel safe in my own neighborhood. I'm married, but I don't identify as straight. And although your identities might not be as complex as mine, I bet I'm not the only one in the room that has hungered to belong. I believe belonging is an inalienable right that should be afforded to everyone regardless of their identity, and I'm not alone in this belief. W.E.B. Du Bois, an American sociologist and civil rights activist who worked to transform the way that lives of Black citizens were seen in America, also believed this, and he explored how our identities impacted our sense of belonging. Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He was born to a free Black family in a comparatively integrated community. He attended the local schools and excelled in his studies, eventually graduating as the valedictorian from his class. However, when he went to college in 1885, he went to Fisk University in Tennessee. He encountered for the first time the open bigotry and repression of the Jim Crow South. And the experience had a profound impact on his thinking. Du Bois returned to the North to further his education with nothing less than equal rights for all Black Americans being his ultimate goal. And in 1895, he was the first Black man to earn a PhD from Harvard University. In 1903, Du Bois wrote his most famous book, The Souls of Black Folk. In the book, he argued that Black people's exclusion from white society is the most important issue facing the 20th century of 20th century. Many would argue that that's still true in the 21st century. Race was and is the barrier that kept Black people from accessing the institutions, spaces, and opportunities available to white people. Du Bois also wrote about his own experiences as a Black man and coined the term double consciousness. Double consciousness is the psychological challenge Black people experienced of always looking at oneself through the eyes of a racist white society and measuring oneself using the tools, using the standards of this community that looked at them with contempt. Du Bois recognized the ways in which double consciousness threatened his ability to enjoy a sense of belonging. And then 112 years later, after he wrote The Souls of Black Folk, I published a study building on his ideas around double consciousness as a way to address the ongoing challenges of belonging in K-12 schools. And although his ideas were very popular among many in the Black community, Du Bois's focus on belonging was not shared by all Black leaders at the time. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery in Virginia, just 13 years before Du Bois. After the Civil War, he worked in a salt mine as a domestic for a white family. And he eventually went to Hampton Institute, one of the first all-Black universities in America. After completing his education, he began teaching, and in 1881, he was selected to head the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama. Tuskegee Institute still stands today. This was sort of a vocational school that sought to give Black people the necessary moral instruction and practical work skills to make them successful in the burgeoning Industrial Revolution. Washington was different than Du Bois. He was less concerned about belonging and believed that it was economic independence and the ability to show themselves as productive members of society that would eventually lead Black people to true equality, and that they should, for the time being anyway, set aside any demands for civil rights. These ideas formed the essence of a speech he delivered to a mixed-race audience at the Cotton State and International Exposition in Atlanta in 1895. There and elsewhere, his ideas were readily accepted by some Black people, but definitely accepted by the white people, who were more than happy for Blacks to defer any real discussion of social and political equality for a later date. His speech was referred to pejoratively as the Atlanta Compromise by its critics, and one of the main critics was Du Bois. Now, both Washington and Du Bois believed in racial uplift, but their plans for getting there were dramatically different. By the early 20th century, Du Bois and Washington were two of the most influential Black men in the country. Washington's conciliatory approach to civil rights made him adept at funding for Tuskegee Institute, as well as for other Black organizations, and also endeared him to the white establishment. White people, including President Roosevelt, who would consult with him on any issues that related to Black people. On the other hand, Du Bois had, by that time, become the country's foremost intellectual, Black intellectual, having published numerous works on the conditions of Black Americans. In contrast to Washington, Du Bois maintained that education and civil rights were only one way to equality, and that conceding their pursuit would simply serve to reinforce the notion of Black people as second-class citizens. He thought that Washington's strategies were too submissive and would cause Black people to give up on equality and accept their status among whites. Du Bois rejected Washington's willingness to avoid rocking the racial boat, calling instead for political power, insistence on civil rights, and the higher education of Black youth. For Du Bois, inclusion and assimilation just were not enough. When asked about what shaped his vision for Black people in America, Du Bois recounted an experience he had while a professor at Atlanta University. He was walking across campus to meet with the editor of the Atlanta Constitution to discuss the case of Sam Hose. This was in 1899. Hose was a black laborer who was accused of murdering his white employer and raping his employer's wife. Du Bois was all too aware that black people were often falsely accused of crimes and then, without judge or without jury, lynched by mobs of regular people, just like you and me. He also learned that Hose's knuckles, listen to this crazy fact, Hose's knuckles were being sold at a store in Atlanta. Du Bois later wrote that the lynching of Hose inspired him to forego the cool, detached logic of an academic for the heated arguments of advocacy. Du Bois's experience is evidence that the racial violence and oppression we have witnessed over the last few years is hardly new. And it was not new a century ago when Du Bois wrote these words: "We bow our heads and hearken soft to the sobbing of women and little children." The black community continues to sob today. Racial oppression has not lifted. Black poverty still shakes and stalks the land, and as Du Bois observed in 1903, to be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom of hardships. Systemic racism is not the only barrier to belonging. Many people who belong to marginalized identities, marginalized groups, struggle to find themselves represented and included. In a recent discussion about belonging with equity leaders from all across the state, I posed this question: who's in charge of belonging? Whose job is that? As the discussion unfolded, it became clear to us that while belonging was a goal, was something that we all knew was important, often we place the responsibility of that belonging on you, on our students. Instead, I believe we should be thinking about the ways in which the system of education is designed to send messages that some students just don't belong. According to researcher and social worker Renee Brown, one of my favorite authors, people are hardwired for connection, love, and belonging. Brown defines belonging as our innate desire to be a part of something larger than ourselves. And even Maslow, Dr. Abraham Maslow, a pioneering social psychologist, ranks belonging as the third in his hierarchy of human needs for human satisfaction and fulfillment. Because this yearning is so primal, we often try to acquire it by seeking to fit in. The problem with trying to fit in, though, is that when we're trying to fit in and seek approval, these are hollow substitutes for belonging, and often actual barriers to belonging. Belonging is about the whole person and begins with self-acceptance. In order to belong, you need to know that you are worthy of being part of something bigger than yourself because of your perceived flaws, not in spite of them. Fitting in, on the other hand, is all about becoming who you need to be in order to fit the rules of a particular social identity group. Belonging is about being seen for who you really are, all identities, all of your identities at the same time simultaneously. So you get to walk in the room and be all of who you really are. That's what true belonging is. While belonging is about acceptance, welcoming is more closely associated with tolerance. Here's a little story for you. Several years ago, I remember going to buy some new cologne. This new cologne called Fierce. Back in those days, and this was a long time ago, I won't give a number so that you don't start doing calculations in your head and trying to guess how old I am. But back in those days, you could smell this Fierce, this cologne, the moment that you walked into the mall. I knew the cologne was only sold at one store, but I wasn't sure where it was, so I decided to just let my nose guide me. My nose led me through Macy's and past Bath & Body Works. As I walked, I ignored the new Air Force Ones at Foot Locker. I resisted the temptation to take a lap at the Gap. And surprisingly, I even skipped the samples at the food court. And after a few minutes, I finally arrived at Abercrombie and Fitch. As I entered, I was greeted by a guy who looked like he had just stepped off the music video set. He looked sort of like that. Rather than making a beeline for the cologne, I decided to play it smooth and check out some of the clothes. There were other people browsing, and so I, joined in with what they were doing, and before long, I was included in the dance of touching fabrics and checking price tags, and also checking sizes. After a quick look, it was clear that there were only two things in the store that would fit me. One was the cologne, and the other was socks. Abercrombie's target customer at that time, and probably still, was at least 20 years younger than me and at least 100 pounds lighter. And although the greeter didn't show it on his face, I'm sure he was wondering, why is this guy in here? He and other sales associates made me feel welcomed, but based on the fact that there was nothing in the store in my size, it was really clear that I didn't belong. This simple story is a reminder of the differences between being welcomed, being included, and then belonging. Welcome is being allowed to enter the room. Inclusion is being allowed to enter the room and have a seat at the table. But belonging is about entering the room, sitting at the table, having your voice being heard, seen, and included and accepted. My Abercrombie story is funny, but the alienation and othering experienced by marginalized individuals across this country is not. So back to Du Bois. Although his efforts led to progress, Du Bois was unable to actually realize his post-slavery views or vision for belonging. But rather than letting the dream die with him, he passed it on to the next generation of leaders. Moments before Dr. Martin Luther King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech during the March on Washington in August of 1963, the prominent civil rights leader Roy Wilkins announced that Du Bois had just died the day before. This is what he said: "If you want to read something that applies to today in 1963, go back and get that volume of The Souls of Black Folks published in 1903. There are just as many reasons why it's helpful to look at Du Bois today as it was in 1963 and way back in the early 20th century. The Souls of Black Folks is an articulation of and clear contribution to the ideas and ethos of some of the activism movements that we see today, movements like Black Lives Matter." In June of 2020, our country witnessed the public murder of George Floyd. For some, the violence was reminiscent of the brutal attacks of black men and women during the post-slavery Reconstruction. For others, it felt like a call for justice that underscored the civil rights movement of the 60s. But for me, I didn't know how to feel. For days, I was paralyzed with sadness, and I could feel my hope for a better future slipping through my fingers. I described myself during that period as hope depleted. But I felt like I needed to do something. So like some of you, I decided to take to the streets and participate in a local protest, one that was right down the street here in Watertown at the gazebo. As we chanted Black Lives Matter, I was struck by the number of young people in attendance. Some of you may have even been there. As we cheered and screamed and knelt, and of course violated all of the social distancing rules that the CDC told us that we should obey, I could feel something changing in me. I could feel my hope increasing. President Obama said this about hope: "Hope is not blind optimism. It's not ignoring the enormity of the task ahead or the roadblocks that stand in our path. It's not sitting on the sidelines or shirking from a fight. Hope is that thing inside of us that insists, despite of all evidence to the contrary, that something better awaits us if we have the courage to reach for it and to work for it and to fight for it. Hope is the belief that destiny will not be written for us, but by us, by the men and women who are not content to settle for the world as it is, who have the courage to remake the world into what it could be. Shortly after the Watertown rally, I told a close friend of mine that I was lucky to be an educator during difficult times like this. As educators, we have the unique opportunity to invest in our students and invest in our futures by investing in our students, by investing in all of you. And regardless of whether or not a student attends my school or my district or the school down the road, I know that there's a spark of brilliance in each of you. And I'm grateful to be in a position, even today, to fan that spark of potential into a raging fire of justice. So how did I get out of that space of being hope depleted? It was you. You renewed my sense of hope. You helped me to believe that a better day is coming. You and students like you helped me to see that you not only believed in the importance of justice, but that you were willing to fight for it. I decided to speak about belonging today because there's a world out there that needs a home, that needs a community, that needs to feel like they belong. There's a world out there that needs you to be the change. There's a world out there that needs you to be the pioneers, the inventors, and the heroes whose dreams for a better world will be talked about in the future. That your work will be talked about during Hispanic Heritage Month, Native American and American Indian Heritage Month, Women's History Month, Asian Pacific Heritage Month, Jewish American Heritage Month, LGBTQ Pride Month, and also Black History Month in the future. And while that may seem like a lot of pressure and a great responsibility to put on you, the good news is that you don't have to start by trying to change the world overnight. You can start by changing yourself, thinking about the ways that you foster a sense of belonging for others. Consider, are there ways that you can call out othering behavior that you see and stand with those who are at the margins? Can you work to cultivate a climate of belonging right here at Taft? Because not only is there a world out there that needs you, there's someone right here in this room that needs you to be the change. Thank you.